All right, begin to quiet your mouths. And 3, 2, 1. Shut up. Hello. Cool. So let's talk about Node a little bit. I hope that by the end of this lesson you'll be able to explain what Node is and create an API using Express. So Node is probably the weirdest This is the thing. It's not a language. It's probably the weirdest programming platform I've seen come out in the last 2 years. And it's been absolutely revolutionary. Even things that are not like Node backend APIs use Node all over the place. React uses Node all over the place. Vue uses Node all over the place. This has been a phenomenally powerful technology built off of the little language that could, JavaScript. So let's, all right, so our first objective, by the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain what Node is. You should be able to create it. Oh, man. Big Ben Benjamin. Think laptops are okay? All right. Indeed. We're all right. We're all right. All right. Back with me. Cool. So let's talk about this first objective, explaining what Node is. So if we go to the Node Foundation, oops, maybe just the Node website. Cool. So this is probably an okay place to start. Now, let's see. What is Node? These a bunch of fucking videos. Oh, perfect. Yeah, this. All right, so I'm going to send out this link, and I'm going to give you a sec to read it, and then we're going to talk about it. All right, this is in the Denver Announce channel. I'm going to put 6 minutes on the clock. Give it a read. Go. Okay, now what I'd like you to do is for the next 2 minutes, brain dump. Everything you retained out of that, just dump it on the page. 2 minutes, go. Type it out. You can write it by hand, I don't give a shit. But just brain dump for 2 minutes straight. Go. $30 seconds. Okay, next thing I want you to do, as you are trying to wrestle what node is into words, probably like struggle a little bit. So I want to take a minute and I want you to write down questions that came up while you were trying to brain dump about node. Go. What are things that you're still just not really clear on? What does X mean? Why is that cool? Why does that matter? How is that different? All right, gang, let's wrap a little bit. So I would love to hear what some of your questions are. Let's start kind of building a list. So, we get a volunteer to help us get our list of node questions started. Yeah. Okay, what category? I like it. And how do you might go over those. Aaron. Oh, yeah. Yeah, middleware pattern. That's Express, that's not Node, but we're going to touch on it. Love it. Ben.
Two questions. The first one is, we talked about the sequence of node execution.
The sequence of node execution?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the next one would be multi-threaded compared to single.
Great question. Sequence of execution. That's really kind of like a sub-question. Single versus multi-thread. Great question. What else? Kat.
I like some clarifications on the non-blocking input-output.
That's actually the same thing. Non-blocking.
And then also, so it's not about the server, so how does it come to relate?
Okay. Not a server per se. I love it. Andrew.
What is the engine and how does that use it?
What is V8? Excellent. Masterson.
Asynchronous programming, how similar is it to React asynchronous? Maybe this is back to the first one, but
Sure.
I want to see how they communicate with the other.
Async and Node versus React. Great. What else? Killer questions.
Also,
Yeah.
the difference is like computer process, like this runs in the computer process versus browser, so I just want to see more specifically.
Computer process.
Maybe a typical file structure or flow.
Getting bit by that unopinionated fucking app, huh? Cool. What else? Give me one more question. I want us to really be able to explain what Node is. Lizzie Con. Cool. Pros and cons. Love it. All right, let's explore these a little bit. Yeah. Pros and cons. All right. So, what category of technology is Node? This is actually a deceptively difficult question because it's not a language. The language is JavaScript. Ta-da. I'd say the most accurate answer to this question is runtime. So, runtime basically means it's a way to run JavaScript. Browsers are one way to run JavaScript, Node is another. Those are like the only two possible ways you could do that. In fact, I think at the beginning of that article they mentioned that there have been other attempts to run JavaScript on the server before, but those are runtimes. Kind of a pretentious word. All you need to know about it right now is that it is a way to execute the language. That's what runtime is. How do you use it? This was brought up in the article. They give you two different ways to use Node. Anybody remember what they were? One is the REPL. So if I just go over here, and I type Node, I can just type regular ass JavaScript stuff. I do 1 + 1. I can do 1, 2, 3 .map x × 2. I can just start typing JavaScript. It's kind of like binding.pry. Ruby actually has a REPL too. And those of you who've been through the Rails stuff, like Rails C, that's a REPL too. read, evaluate, print, loop. But it basically just means you're in an interactive terminal where you're writing in that language, not in Bash or something like that. Okay, so that's one way I can do it. What's the other way that I do it? Yep, I can just write some JavaScript file. So like that map file from the lesson on functional programming. If I type node, where am I? If I type node, I could have swore I had a file called map. No. There we go. If I run that file, which just has some JavaScript in it, it executes it. Done. So running Node, two ways, interactive, non-interactive. We can run a file or we can just start going. Okay. I'm going to punt on this middleware pattern until we get into the second objective, but it's a really interesting pattern, and there's nothing else in the program that we cover right now that's really even close to it. So all of these questions about sequence of execution, single-threaded, multi-threaded, non-blocking, these kinds of things, and kind of starting in on async and node, that one's really interesting. So there's two different ways we can do asynchronous code. Single-threaded, multi-threaded. I mentioned this at Sandown, I think, yesterday. When we're talking about threads, we're just talking about processor cores, more or less. It's how many simultaneous things that we can do, that we can tell the computer to do. So my favorite analogy for this is diners in the restaurant. An 11xer who's heard me do this before, what's the diners in the restaurant analogy? Ben?
So we can take the order and we don't have to wait for the chef to finish the order and then we can do the same.
Yep. So if this is over here, we got a kitchen. And over here, we have a restaurant. I've got a table here, and a table here, and a table here. And I have a waiter for every single one of these tables. Running instructions back and forth. But if I only have 3 waiters, I can only serve 3 tables. But they get a lot of attention. Single-threaded, I've got the restaurant and the kitchen. This time I only have 1 waiter. And what the waiter does, he checks on this table, this table, this table, drops off all the orders, sees if any are ready. Goes, okay, cool, the second table's ready. Oh, by the way, did you need anything? Okay, cool. And then I'm gonna drop off your order. Oh, and you'd also like this other thing? Awesome, I'll drop it off. And you don't need anything. Cool, I'm dropping off that one order. Another order is ready, here's your order. And we just go around and around and around like that. That's the difference between single-threaded and multi-threaded. Talked about this a little bit at Sandown yesterday. Anybody remember the trade-offs with these? Yep. What else? Indeed. Yeah, could be. Sort of depends on how many tables you have, though. Yeah.
So would each thing be like a request or like server to client side communication or?
Not necessarily. Probably more like, I'm gonna have this one thread working on a database request while I have this other thread hitting an API. So I can do both of those things simultaneously, and when they come back, I'll have a third thread combine their output. Something like that. And then as soon as I'm done with one, I'll release that thread back into the pool.
On single, can one table, for instance, like hold up the rest of them?
Yes, it definitely can. Oh, that's a really good point. So there's JavaScript has a way of handling that now. Node does also. But what's kind of interesting about this, single tends to work really good for if the number of tables changes a lot. We go 3 tables to 5 to 500 back down to 1. It's cool. All that happens is as you add more tables, this waiter takes a little bit longer each time. Multi-threading, you have to actively manage all these things. You make another table over here, we gotta wait for these things to not need a waiter anymore. Trickier.
So basically, if multi-threaded, the code would be for threads being like reserved for like one thing at a time.
And then you need to like release them so they can go on to the next thing. So, talk about it, Sandown. This tends to be really good for teeny tiny little tasks. Graphics cards. Graphics cards have tons of cores. Figuring out what color a pixel should be lends itself very well to that kind of thing. Meanwhile, something like handling API requests lends itself very well to this model. Sometimes you have a shit ton of requests, sometimes not so much. Scales up and down really well. So, talked about single versus multi-threaded. Non-blocking, that just means that if I have this 4th table here, it isn't blocked from doing something before these 3 threads resolve. That's all it is. We can still accept requests. We can still seat more tables. It just gets slower.
What would be an example of one that uses multi-threaded?
Lower level stuff almost always is, like C and C++. I've been told that Ruby will run off of either. So like if you're running a Rails server or something, you actually can pick which type of server that runs on top of. I can't speak too much to like the practical side of that, but that's what I was told.
So, it's not running on the browser, so the browser doesn't need to see anything.
Yes.
It doesn't have an option, doesn't have an option to run on more time.
Yes, and that's like Kat's point about the one table that won't shut the fuck up. In Node, what you can do is start what's called a child process and have it take over like that really long request. On the browser, you have a thing called a web worker, where if you need to do a high intensity processing thing, but you don't want your UI to freeze in the meantime, you can spawn a web worker and have it work on that. So even with single threading, there are ways to work around that problem. Oh, another example of non-blocking IO. And this is like just sort of the asynchronous nature of JavaScript. Just think about how we do promises. Remember when we fire off a fetch request and we do all the rest of the synchronous things and then we wait to see if that came back, and if it did, and if that triggers off some kind of asynchronous thing, we see if there's more synchronous work to do, and then. If we didn't have that, if we had a blocking IO, when we fired off that fetch request, we literally couldn't do anything else until it's done. In the context of a web app, that means our UI is frozen. Like, no animations are happening, nobody can click on anything, nobody can do anything. That's blocking IO. And that's waiting for a thread to clear up. Meanwhile, okay, cool, you're still deciding, I'll come back.
Does blocking, non-blocking have anything to do with sockets?
No. Sockets are a different conversation. They're, the TLDR is, they use the layer, technology layer below HTTP. HTTP is sent via TCP. Sockets are just TCP directly instead of using HTTP on top of them. Okay, so it's not a server, but it connects to databases. We use it to build servers, all those kinds of things. So the big gimmick there is that there are a couple of modules built into Node. They're mentioned in this article. HTTP and HTTPS for creating web servers. It's built into the runtime that you can start up web servers. So Node itself is not a web server, but it comes with baked in server technology. Cool. What is V8? Who can tell me that? Yep. It's Google Chrome's, you might even say, runtime for JavaScript. So a browser is a few different things, right? A browser is and a not all the way accidental thing. All of this stuff in a browser is called the browser's Chrome. Like the tabs, the URL bar, these things, all this shit. That's called browser Chrome. And with the browser Chrome, you have menus and features and a plugin system and like all that kind of stuff. That's like one of the main differentiating features between different browsers is their features and their Chrome. That's one part of it. Another part of it is the DOM rendering engine. This is HTML and CSS. You're looking at a picture of a flower with, okay, so it's reading your HTML and your CSS, it's building this DOM tree, and it's rendering it. So you need a rendering engine. And then there's a button like that fires off JavaScript when you interact with it, and that's a JavaScript engine. The browsers have Chrome, a rendering engine, and a durable script engine. V8 is Chrome's JavaScript engine. Ryan Dahl, the guy who made Node, just ripped it out. It's an open source project, so we have the code for it. Just ripped that part of it out, and it's like, okay, some things we need to change because there's no document.create element. There's no document. So like, there's some things that we need to change about this and tweak. But mapping through arrays and those kinds of things, those don't need any concept of the DOM or a document or anything like that. So we can just work with them independently. Dope. And then he built an entire runtime around that. Cool. Last couple. Async and Node versus React. Honestly, it's basically the same. There's a technical difference between how this is done in Node versus how it's done in browsers. If you're interested in reading more about it, read about libuv. That's the specific technology that Node uses to do this like later single-threaded thing. But otherwise, probably a bit much for an intro. Computer process. This is badass. This is where we get into things that we can't do in the browser. You know what you can't do in the browser? Interact with the file system. Holy shit, could you imagine if you could? Like, how easy it would be to like steal your parents' shit? Click on this link. Oh, I'm sorry, I guess you just zipped up your entire home directory and mailed it to me. Yeah, whatever. That's like, it's very, very bad. So, there's a lot of things that you can't really interact directly with your computer. You have to do it all via your browser. So you can upload files, and you can do a lot of things that are like whitelisted, basically just things that your browser allows you to do, sort of separate from the runtime. In Node, kind of like the document object, we have a thing called the process object that lets us do things like see how many processor cores we have, spin up child processes, read environment variables, do a lot of stuff that like wouldn't make any sense to do in the browser. And we have a file module that lets us read files, write files. This is how it like powers things like Create React App. Because you can say, all right, here's some configuration. I'm gonna make a file, I'm gonna put this boilerplate in it, I'm gonna make this folder, I'm gonna put this file in this folder. That's why it's used in all these build tools and shit now, because it has access to a file system. You can do these same things in Ruby, you can do the same things in Python, but oh, baby, is it delightful to write in Node compared to those two, I think. I'm gonna punt on this until the next objective. Pros and cons. Pros, works really well for something like HTTP requests, where we're just getting a whole bunch of them in. We need to scale up and down pretty rapidly. Works well for that. Somebody had mentioned that doesn't work quite as well if there's really only one of these that's like super active. Everybody else is just a sometimes. You end up running a lot and you kind of don't need to. That works a little bit better for that. Another pro of Node, like you only got one language you can use in the browser anyway. What if you could also use, all your JavaScript developers didn't have to learn a new language to program on the back end. Another good reason to use Node. Neat, so with our first objective, explaining what Node is, give me your remaining questions. I'm going to ask you to write your explanation of what Node is in a sec. That was a real good time to clear up any remaining misunderstandings.
What were the cons?
If you aren't dealing with like burst up and burst down scalability, you end up wasting a lot of cycles waiting for something that if it were multi-threaded, you have a lot more flexibility over. I'd also say the downside is that you have to use JavaScript. It doesn't have a type system. It's dynamic in some of the worst ways. Its OO capabilities are and so for all the reasons that like other languages have legitimate advantages over JavaScript, you can just use those languages.
By burst up, burst down scalability, do you mean like the number of people are using it at once and like interactions?
Tons of traffic all at once, and then no traffic for a little while. You got a Super Bowl ad. Node is going to scale that a lot better than almost anything else. Because with a multi-threaded thing, you want to do that, then you have to have all of those like threads waiting, and then you need to like load balance that, versus this, it just gets a little bit slower each time. Better. What else? Yeah, Kat.
Can you just go in a little bit on what it means by event-driven?
Absolutely. That's one of the things that libuv does. It's how you know, like it's not actually running around these tables. That is a technique though of polling. It's a lot more like each of those tables can ring a bell. That's an event. And so it goes, cool. And then whenever that's ready, the fetch request comes back or whatever, that rings a bell. And then you can do something in response. It's callbacks. Yeah.
So, is that true that Node is, when you execute a Node, then it will transfer it to C++?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
V8 is written in C and C++. And so you write your JavaScript. JavaScript, like, there's a whole bunch of jumps you need to go to get from array.map whatever the fuck down to ones and zeros. And so you have a lot of translation layers in between, and C and C++ are one of them.
Can you explain again how they're activated?
Yeah.
Or
So.
what is the database is?
Sure. If I've got a node server running, and I have a database server running, generally speaking, these are two different computers, either physical or logical. But like, each database has a protocol that it wants you to send it queries with. And so it's kind of like an HTTP request. In fact, it's exactly like an HTTP request. It just doesn't use HTTP. It uses a different format. And so like for Postgres, that's the Postgres QL, I want to say. No, I don't think that's the QL. It's the Postgres protocol. And you send it to the whatever address that this server is on. You send it to a particular port, and it's formatted a particular way, and it reads that as a query, runs it, and it gives you the response back, and then you do something with it. So unlike in the browser, we do that with fetch, and Node, you do that with a database driver, but all it's doing is making a network request with this particular protocol.
So what's sort of stronger there, like instead of using Rails and active record,
Mhm.
what are the drawbacks to it? Because active record does a lot for you, right?
Oh, absolutely. There's equivalents on Node.
Okay.
So like, we have Active Record, which is some of the best software of any kind I've ever used. I'm a big fan of Active Record. The equivalent, but like that category of tool is called an ORM. There's tons of ORMs for Node. There's one called Objection, that's probably my favorite. The most popular one is called Sequelize. But there's dozens of them, of varying levels of quality, but these two are the hot ones.
The biggest difference I found is just the opinionated versus unopinionated opinion. And Rails and Ruby is the most opinionated, but it's still much more like if you see one Rails app, you're gonna kind of know what it looks like versus I've just started scratching the surface of Node and like every time to look at it. It's not wildly different, but it's pretty different. And you can
Absolutely.
do it however the hell you want to in language speed. You've got to do it one way. Like there's one correct way to do things. But no, there's not one correct way to do things.
I've read around a lot of it, kind of seems like, I mean, there's like a bunch of ways you can do it, but it seems like most everyone gets all the routes kind of in one file, and you do a database from somewhere else.
There's some like architecture best practices that you absolutely do not have to follow. And so like another way of putting that is, it ships with all the foot guns included. So if you want to shoot yourself in the foot, it will not stop you. It will not put up a fight. But you can write very elegant architectures. You can write stuff that looks exactly like Rails. But with Rails, you follow the rules, you get all this stuff for free. You can follow all the same rules as Rails, you're not getting shit for free. You're coding every stitch of that. There's no like, well, I named my routes a particular way, and so I can just say resources, and it knows that I need a controller that's in this file and this folder, and it'll call this method, and it'll pass in these, like, that doesn't happen. You can do all those things, but you gotta do them by hand. And then you might say you have to do them in Rails. And so if you did do something that wasn't just a CRUD app, that gets increasingly difficult to do. Whereas that might be much easier to do if it has no expectations about how your app works in the first place.
I know it's better than free, but just for knowledge sake, why the fuck do I want to use Node then? Like, I get all this shit for free, then I
Absolutely.
myself.
So good reason is if you really dig JavaScript, and I do, like for example, good luck trying to write any of these cool functional transformations we were looking at in the FP lesson in Ruby. Not going to happen. You were just in for a world of pain with that. So like if that lends itself very well to your project, then like I would go with something like Node or Scala or one of these kinds of languages for your back end. I would say that middleware pattern is mighty powerful. And you have to do all those with services in Rails, and I think that the middleware metaphor, it works for me a lot more. So things like auth and logging, and if you're trying to iteratively build out this architecture, I've always had an easier time doing that in Node than with a monolithic architecture. However, Laravel, Rails, these big opinionated frameworks, like if you'll drink the Kool-Aid on them, they're pretty damn nice. But you also spend a lot of time figuring out like what Joel was talking about this morning, the Rails way to do things. Because it'll fucking fight you if you try to do something that isn't the Rails way, and it'll make you regret it. So sometimes like, I know exactly what I need to do. If I could just write the code, if it's right there. And you end up burning 3 days trying to figure out like what Rails wants you to do. And so, trade-offs.
Are there other event-driven, single-threaded, non-blocking servers?
Almost definitely. I can't list any off the top of my head, but none that use JavaScript, though. Other questions? Yeah.
Can you explain non-blocking again?
Yeah, absolutely. So, non-blocking is this person's still deciding what they want, I just move on. If I'm in a blocking architecture, I gotta wait until this person makes up their mind before I can move on. All right, you have to explain what Node is to someone. What are you gonna say? Think about it in your head. And we're gonna do one more round of questions. What you got? All right, so I come up to Rob and Party, the real name Party, bunch of just jabronis there. They want to talk about things like JavaScript runtimes. They go, hey, so I heard you were learning Node in school today. What is Node? They're probably able to figure that out. And you say?
I say, I'm trying to think about how to like make it very equivalent. You can say like, single-threaded server language based on JavaScript. Uses the Chrome V8 engine. I don't know.
Well, tell you what, let's use the strategy that Joel was talking about. Short answer, a little bit longer, a little bit longer. What's your one sentence definition of Node?
It's a backside computer language, or
Back-end computer.
computer language programming.
Back-end programming language? JavaScript's the language. Sure. Runtime is what it actually is. If you want to say technology, that's fine too. It's a back-end programming runtime. For what language? Cool. So we can probably scratch that and say it's a back-end JS runtime. It doesn't have to be on the back end though. We use it to like build React apps and stuff. And so what can we do to improve on this word? Server-like? Server-side would be like synonymous with back-end. If I'm using this to build React architecture kind of shit also. Okay. You can't use it with browsers and shit though.
It runs directly in your process rather than your browser.
Yeah. And so I would probably call this, if you're looking for a good word, maybe independent. It's not bound to a browser. Independent JavaScript runtime. Run JavaScript on any computer, not just in a browser. All right, so that's our one sentence Node explanation. We're going for 2 or 3. What kinds of things do we want to add? Casual language. We're at a lame party here.
It allows JavaScript to create a server environment.
Yep. Create servers with JS. What else do we want to say? Run JS outside the browser? Absolutely. What else? Can be used, well, let's say, includes a REPL. What else? Give me another one. Cool. Can access your file system. Awesome. And then if this is all you remember about Node, that's fine. Below that, what other things are we including? Technical details. Scalable. How many threads? Single threaded. Notice single threaded. It runs around in a circle. Yes. JavaScript, all JavaScript engines are single threaded. Now there's ways you can fake that out though. On the front end, you use web workers that just uses another thread to do a JavaScript kind of thing. You're sort of forking it off of the main one, so owned by this. There's this very similar thing in Node with child process. You go, I want this child process to do something with a different processor for. You can even say like, all right, I've split up this workload, so this should use every single processor core. And since you can see how many processor cores you have with process, you can fork a process a bunch of times. You can use all your cores. Still ways to do this, but it's not a fundamental part of the thing.
So is Node package manager its own thing, or is it something you built off?
Yeah, we haven't talked about NPM at all. NPM is a tool. It comes with Node. If you've installed Node, you also have NPM. It does not stand for Node Package Manager. If you go to their website, it's Norwegian polka music. It's never post memes. Naturally pacifist marsupials. New patch. Merge? So they stopped calling it Node Package Manager because they do so many other things. Not really. It is an independent organization that currently is like in the process of being canceled because the people who run it are assholes. It works exactly like Gem does. I think, well, it serves the exact same purpose that Gem does. I think it does it in a way fucking better way. And I think it learned a lot of lessons from Gem. For example, when you Gem install something, where does it put that Gem you just installed? Who fucking knows? But it installs it once in your computer somewhere. That's why you get so many weird version issues whenever you're like bundle installing something. The Node, on the other hand, keeps it all with the project. So I think it's a much saner way to do that. And like several other things also. But it's a way to install other people's JavaScript and run it in your Node program. For example, And I want to make sure you guys get a chance to go to your study hall. But, all right, I have nothing in this folder, nothing up this sleeve, nothing up this sleeve. If I do npm init, it's going to walk me through a bunch of stuff. What do you want to call this? Sounds good. Initial version of it? Why not? No description. Yeah, entry point is that file. Test command is mocha, will be. Here's the git repo. Test, don't use, whatever. And it was written by me. And there's the license. So all that does is create this package.json file. And if we look inside of it, it's got all that stuff that we just filled out. And it's going to be like our gem file. It just keeps track of what packages we want to install. So if I want to, for example, install Express, which is a way to build servers really easily in Node, npm install Express. It goes to npmjs.org. It finds the package called Express, and it links to a repo over here, and it just installs this. That's it. That's all it does. And if you're curious about how that works under the hood, now I have this node modules folder and a package lock JSON file. This is exactly like gem file lock. This has general instructions about what versions to use, like something greater than 5. This has the specific versions, like version 5.1.2. In that node modules folder, this has every package that it needed. So all we install is Express, but Express has a package.json file. It has dependencies. So those get installed, and those have dependencies, and those get installed. So once it's figured out all of those, these are all of the node modules that we pulled in. And if we look at Express, it has an index.js file. This is the file that runs when we require that package. So it just pulls out this one, says all this stuff in it, and then this function is the thing that actually happens. So we zoom back out. This is my app. I've got Express installed. I have this package JSON file. If I make an index.js file and require in Express, what's Express? Who can tell me? It's that the create server function that was in that one file. Yes, Express is a module. I'm pulling it in. Those of you who've done React, this require thing predates import export, but it does the exact same thing. And the syntax is annoyingly this different. If I want to make an Express app, I just invoke that create app function. And then to make it fire, I tell it some port to listen on. And that's it. If I want to make it respond to a route, app.get route. It takes a method, a path, and a function. And that function gets called with 2 arguments, request, response. And let's say I want to just respond, response.json message hi. And if I run this file with Node, it is now running that server. So if I go over here, fire up old Postman. Oh, this is taking forever. Localhost 9,000. There we go. And so if I want to have some data, And I want to respond with students. Run that.
Would you say it's like lighter weight than Rails? 'Cause I mean,
Oh, yeah.
that's one file with some numbers that versus Rails.
Now, like what inevitably happens is you go, God, that was so easy to get started. And your app gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And you go, why the fuck did I do this with Rails? So like there is like a friction point there where you're like, I'm doing so much work right now that I have this complicated architecture. So a thing to keep in mind. But yeah, dude, like we're done. Like it's pretty good. Cool. So, I just started using the wireless module on this thing. I hate how quickly it goes to sleep. All right, so let's express independent JavaScript runtime. Let's you create servers with JavaScript. So you run JavaScript outside the browser. Here's a REPL. You can access your file system. If that's all you say about explaining what Node is, it's pretty good. That's what it is. Creating the API using Express. We didn't do it together, but that's all we were going to do. What do you do?
So the scalability, when do you think you started to see it on that edge, like this is getting too big, and like, does that include just models, or is that just like for your controllers and around?
So let me show you the develop Denver backend, which is Node. So this is like getting to the point where it might have just been easier to do this with Rails. So entry point on this app is, let's see, there. So we end up importing all this stuff, and like I wrote this whole thing. This is dumb. Like you get this for free with a lot of other stuff. And it's not even all that comprehensive. It was just I had a problem once and I had to write something to handle those. Same thing with error handling. I had to write all my own error handlers for this. The architecture of this looks like suspiciously like a Rails app. It's got models, it's got controllers, except I didn't get active record. I had to write all this shit. So if like this is like the active model that you import from in all of your models, and then you don't do anything else and get all that magic for free. Well, somebody had to write all that code, and in this case, it was me. So if I want to list everything in a particular model, like I had to write the query for that. I want to find something. And what's kind of neat is that you can do things like, we have this custom permissions model where admins can see more with the same thing than a regular user can. So, like, when I have an event or something like that, maybe a regular user can't see who submitted it, but when I'm saying I want to select these fields from the database, that property list is a function that takes whether or not someone's an admin, and if they are, it's usually a star that they get back. Otherwise, it's a list of like whitelisted properties they get back. That's pretty cool. There's a way to do that in Rails that's like, you don't have to write yourself and test and debug and all that other kind of shit, but then you got to figure out what that is. And So like I said, this is probably about the sort of size where it might have just been easier. It's not even that big. We're talking like 8 models here, 6 controllers. I did all this auth by hand, which I'm still not sure if this is a great idea. Where I would absolutely use this over Rails is like in my last job, I had a bunch of little services that I have to write. And we actually use those a lot in developed Ember too. When you upload a picture, you might upload a 100 megabyte picture. You might not even know you were uploading something that big. And since like that could, on Heroku, that freezes up the entire backend until it's done processing. That's not event driven. It has to like actually chew through all that shit. And I don't want to block the entire functionality of the app for every single user in the world while you're uploading your giant ass picture. And so I have a single service, a single endpoint API. All it does is take pictures, name them, parse them, all this kind of shit, and send it over to AWS. Runs completely separate from the app. Rails would be ridiculous to use for that.
Is it common or like ever done where you make like kind of a micro backend structure? Where you have like a huge Rails app that doesn't necessarily, maybe not like a Node, like server-based picture thing?
Why, you might call those microservices, in fact. Yeah, it's a super common pattern. That's what we did at my last job. Is it was a monolith, it was a Laravel monolith, but anytime we needed to add a new feature, I would really like, I don't know if I should add an endpoint or if I should just spin up a Rails or a Node service for it that just does that one thing and then make an HTTP request to it. You have to make a network request, which, as hopefully most of you know by now, is expensive. But like there's other trade-offs to that. You can scale them separately. You have a monolith. You have to scale everything up or down. I have a little microservice. I can scale that however I need to, separate from the main app. All right, I'm cutting into study hall. Shoot. Thank you very much. Yeah.